Well, sure. I mean, Mark makes a fantastic theoretical argument. There's no doubt about that. And if we were looking at a thesis or a dissertation, it's a fantastic topic. But here's the reality of it. The reality is that the population changes, the population grows, and the population shifts. So in Williamson County, the population of 422,000 people, I unfortunately have to lose 51,000 people. Charles Schwartner has to lose 60,000 people. The dynamics are fundamentally different. Populations change. So I think what we did was we looked very carefully at the core of what we do in Williamson County stayed the same. It is the city of Round Rock, it is the city of Hutto, and it is the city of Taylor. There's no huge shift. There's no huge difference. There's not a dynamically, drastically looking area. We kept largely what already exists, and we kept them whole. Is it more Republican? Yes, but so is the growth. If you look at the corridors of where the growth has been in Round Rock and even in Hutto and Taylor, you look at the dynamics of it. You look at the numbers and realize that that's where the growth is. That's what the growth is. So it's not that you came in here necessarily, although the argument can be made absolutely that is what happens. When we looked at it, that's where the growth is. You have to look at Northern Round Rock and understand that that's what it is. So there's
Larry,
the theoretical
how
version of
can
the
that be
practical.
the case if your district was represented by a Democrat after the growth had occurred as recently as a year ago?
Well,
I mean, or let me ask the question another way.
Okay.
If Democrats were drawing the map, could they draw a Democratic district in Williamson County?
It would be hard. It would be hard to do that. The growth is overwhelmingly Republican-based conservatives. There are a lot of reasons to get into the 08 and 10 elections as to why Mike Crucy, a Republican, had it in 6, a Democrat had it in 8, and then a Republican then has it in 10, under the same map. I mean, that's what that district looks like.
Right. The point is, it was a swing district that won't be a swing district anymore after Republicans redrew the map to make it a much more Republican district. There's an alternative to that. It's not theoretical. There are states that do it another way, and they get more competitive districts, and the voters there then get represented by people who are accountable to all the voters in their district, not just the primary voters in their district, and I just think that's what the voters want.
But what I would argue is you got to look at the states that Mark's talking about. Which states and how? Are they as diverse? You know, people talk about the Iowa plan. Is Iowa as diverse, not just geographically, but population-wise, voter-wise, voting age population-wise, ethnicity, race? Does it lay out more on a grid than Texas does naturally? Are the cities set up differently? When you try to compare state to state, I think you start looking at more apples and oranges than you look at specifically what's Texas. And I think the reality is Texas is different than Iowa. Texas plays out and looks differently than Iowa. And so those are apples and oranges to me when you look at kind of how that actually works. And
I'd say that argument speaks for itself. We should probably get on to something the voters find more interesting.
All right, so well, we've got 101 Republicans in the House right now, but under the map there, some of those seats might not be as safe as what I've heard. Maybe somewhere around 90, 92 of those seats might be safe. What does that say about the fact that we have a Republican chair on that committee, but then doesn't look like the party's winning?
I have no idea what to say about that. I have no idea how that breaks down. You know, people can argue what's winnable, what's not winnable. Quite frankly, there are so many variables that go into that. Candidates top of the ticket, local candidates, down ballot candidates, the candidate you have, the challenger you have. There are so many variables involved that I don't think you look at a map and go yay or nay when you have to look at and consider all the different variables on the ballot on that day in that area. Down ballot, up ballot affects a whole lot of different races.
You're raising an interesting point. There's this movement from those who opposed the current speaker at the beginning of the session to say that because the proposed map doesn't protect all 101 incumbent Republicans in safe Republican districts, then this map sells out the Republican Party. You know, you can just describing it that way ought to indicate to the voters how perverse and undemocratic the redistricting process is. To suggest that they're all entitled to have safe seats is just absurd. But it's also a disingenuous argument. Everybody knows that if the Republican Party wanted to just maximize its own self-interest in this redistricting, what it would do is create 90 or so, who knows whether the exact number is 90 or 92 or 87, very safe Republican seats that even population growth, like what occurred in Williamson County over the past decade, won't change the outcomes of those elections in terms of whether they elect Republicans or Democrats. To do that, you've got to create districts with 60% or more Republican majorities. And you can't do that in 101 seats or even probably 97 seats. You might be able to do it in somewhere between 87 to 92 seats. It's wrong to do it in the first place. But if your interest is in who's being the better Republican, which is what a lot of that debate is about from those who were critics of the speaker at the beginning of the session, the better Republican thing is to create a smaller number of very safe seats that you don't have to worry about losing the next time there's a tidal wave election or losing due to demographic changes and population growth. All of it is an absurdity that we shouldn't be dealing with or even talking about on a Sunday morning show when we're dealing with a budget crisis that is causing us to cut $7 billion from public education, 30% from nursing home reimbursements, and all of these other terrible things we're doing in the budget.
You said that obviously that we might be wasting too much time on redistricting. I remember the other day Dan Branch said that maybe we wouldn't even, the legislature wouldn't be the ones to actually decide this. Is that going to be the case? Are we spending all this time on the maps and then lawmakers might not even have the final say?
As a practical matter, my guess, and it's just a guess, is that it's more likely that the legislature doesn't enact a map than that it does. And that's not because the legislature is going to take the position I've taken that we shouldn't be doing this, but more because if the legislature doesn't act under our current laws, which are flawed, the responsibility falls to the Legislative Redistricting Board. That entity is controlled by all the statewide elected Republicans. So it would give Republican leadership even more power than they have in a 101 to 49 Republican majority House over the final outcome of these maps. There is no good outcome to this process. It's sort of something that, you know, I feel as frustrated as the voters must feel about the way that the political system perpetuates its own power at the expense of the people through this process. But frankly, it is what it is, as Larry's kind of said. You're not going to change it in time to change the process this session. And so I'm choosing to spend more of my time focusing on this budget problem.
And I know, Josh, it's really easy to look at R&D, and that's kind of the quick look that everybody looks at, right? Everybody wants to examine those numbers. But the truth of the matter is, as Mark well knows, we've talked about before, there are lots of other things you have to look at. There are lots of other considerations when you look at the Voting Rights Act. You know, when you look at what the Department of Justice is looking at to make sure that those sections 2 and 5 are going to be enforced. I mean, there are a lot of other variables here. It isn't just maximizing an R versus D. You have to always realize that there are lots of other safeguards in place to protect certain populations. That's what it is, to protect communities of interest. That's why the law is there. That's why it happens. So to get to an R versus D argument very quickly, okay, but you have to go out in a broader picture and look to make certain that all those other safeguards that are in place are actually being accomplished as well. And that's the question that the courts will inevitably look at. They will inevitably have to consider is, okay, so here's this map, is it legal? And that's going to be the question raised sometime this summer or fall, I'm sure, is in determining, is it legal? So the Republican versus Democrat argument is the quick one. The bigger, more thoughtful one is all the other considerations and what the court rules on probably this fall, maybe as late as November.
Are we setting ourselves up for any lawsuits, you think?
There's always lawsuits.
And it's already been filed. I mean,
there's already 2.
There's one already filed, yeah, absolutely.
There will be a lot more,
There'll be a lot
and
more.
it'll, you know, it'll be a lawyer's full employment act for the next year or so, and it'll eventually get resolved. And the good news is that the best efforts of politicians to entrench themselves in office can still be overcome by the voters. And we've seen that in the last couple of election cycles where big surges in 2008 among Democratic supporters and in 2010 among Republican supporters have caused a lot of incumbents to get beat despite their best efforts to use every trick in the book to perpetuate themselves in office. And so I think, you know, I think that's probably the most important thing about all of this, is that at the end of the day, despite their best efforts, politicians will still be vulnerable to the will of the voters, and that's a good thing. That's why our country works.